Hello, everyone. I'm so glad to be here today to talk to you about McMaster's Will, the scheme that almost freed us, the story of the freedom struggle of my great-great-grandfather and our family's patriarch, Aaron McMasters. This presentation will also introduce you to my forthcoming book by the same title. Now, I always get asked why I wrote the book, and I have two reasons. One is that stories like my great-great-grandfather's are often absent from the history that we're taught. And even when they are taught, it's very rarely from the perspective of those who endured slavery like Aaron McMasters. And the second reason is, well, it's just a hell of a story. First, let me tell you a little bit about myself. I was born and raised in Siler City, North Carolina, that's in Chatham County, and I currently live in Washington, D.C. I'm a proud graduate of Duke University. I was a Fulbright Scholar to Morocco, and I am principal and co-founder of RC Communications, a public relations firm in Washington, D.C. Now, what you can expect from this presentation today is that I want to introduce you to my family's incredible story, but I also want to share what I've learned in my discovery journey, and I hope that it can help you in yours. Now, for the topics that we're going to cover today, I'll try to give you as much detail as time allows. And I'll also take some time to cover some of the basics that many of you may already be familiar with. I want to make sure that we can all learn from something today, from the genealogical veterans to those of you who may have just started on your family tree. Now, throughout this presentation, I'll give tips to help you in your research, and I'll indicate it with this. I look forward to the Q&A session after the presentation so I can hear from you. One of the many things that I love about my family's story is that when it comes to telling it, there are so many places that you can begin. For you folks today, I think the perfect place to start is February 10th, 1852. Now I want you to picture my great-great-grandfather, Aaron McMasters, who was enslaved in his late 30s in Randolph County, North Carolina. Aaron has just received a letter from a man named Jesse Kemp. A few months earlier, Aaron had asked his advice on whether he should escape slavery in North Carolina and come to Indiana, where Jesse Kemp lived, for a better and safer life. Let's look at the beginning of the letter. Park County, Indiana, 2nd month, 10th day, 1852. Respected friend Aaron McMasters, thy letter dated September 29, 1851 has been received, and after some consideration, I saw purpose to answer it. Thee request my view relative to thy coming to this country, which I very willingly give thee. My opinion in regard to this has not changed. I have, ever since the death of thy master Simeon McMasters, felt a great anxiety for thee to remove to some free government. I give it as my opinion that it would be wise for thee to leave Carolina. Now that's about as unambiguous of an answer if I've ever seen one. But as strong as Jesse Kemp felt about Aaron fleeing North Carolina, he did not withhold from Aaron that life in the West had its own challenges. Here's what Jesse Kemp had to say. I'm sorry to say that there is great prejudice in this country against colored people. People of this country do not seem disposed to make slaves of them, but not to have them here, they have made laws with the view of keeping them away. However, notwithstanding these laws, there are many people of color in this state, some of whom, thinking their privileges be greater and themselves more secure, are moving to Canada, where I presume they can enjoy something near the privileges of white people. And if I were of that black complexion, I would prefer Canada to Carolina or any other slave state beyond calculation. If I were in thy place and know what I do know, I would come to Ohio or Indiana. And if I could not find that to suit me, I would go to Canada, which can be done in just a few days from here. Now, my great-great-grandfather had a life-defining choice to make, to flee to a free state or remain in North Carolina enslaved. And this decision would not only affect him, it would affect his family and even down to me. Life decisions like the ones that my great-great-grandfather had to make are very complicated. So how did we get here? Or more precisely, how did Aaron McMasters get to this decision-making moment? First, let's orient ourselves geographically. Aaron is in North Carolina, Randolph County, which is right near the Chatham County line in the geographic center of the state. I'm very fortunate that my research journey was concentrated in these two counties where I grew up and my family still lives. This was not only helpful for locating official government records, but it also meant that the people, descendants, key places and locations that I really needed to learn more about were within a 30-mile radius of the house where I grew up. From my great grandparents' home to the family cemetery to other precious landmarks, I literally grew up surrounded by my family's history. And here's a research tip about county research. When you're doing your search for county records, always expand your search to the surrounding counties, even if you have no indication that your ancestor or whoever you're researching lived or transacted business there. This is necessary for two reasons. One, sometimes people transacted business where they didn't live for a variety of reasons. Maybe the person they were marrying lived in the next county and they happened to be married there. Maybe a deed of trust for property or a purchase was recorded where the seller lived, not necessarily the buyer. So lots of reasons for that to happen. The second reason is that as I researched more and more counties, we know that some counties used to be part of neighboring counties or vice versa. And so for the time period you're researching, sometimes the county boundaries took a while for folks to get used to, especially when they were referring to their history. For example, an informant on a death certificate in one of the records for my family says that his parent was born in one county when in actuality, it was another county. They just didn't realize that the other county hadn't existed when their parent was born. So now let's talk a little bit about who was Aaron McMasters. As I said, Aaron was my great-great-grandfather on my maternal side, who was born around 1814 in Randolph County, North Carolina, near the Chatham County line. He was born enslaved because his mother, my great-great-great-grandmother, Creasy McMasters, who was born sometime around the 1790s, was enslaved at the time of his birth. Aaron's enslaved status was due to the legal doctrine and practice of assigning enslaved or free status based on the condition of the mother. That's known as partus sequitur ventrum, which is Latin for that which is brought forth from the belly or the womb. Now, that begs the question, who was Aaron's father? Well, Aaron's father, and I've verified this through DNA research, was Simeon McMasters, who was also his enslaver. So who was Simeon McMasters? Well, he was the 13th of 14 children born to immigrants from what is present-day Northern Ireland. He was born around 1767, somewhere between Chester County, Pennsylvania, and Randolph County, North Carolina. Simeon's parents came to Central North Carolina, which is also known as the Piedmont, for the same reason that many families migrated at that time. The land was extremely cheap. Now, Simeon married into a family that had migrated much like his, but his wife died young and bore him no children. Now, during his lifetime, Simeon owned two enslaved people, Creasy and Aaron. And as you probably guessed, Aaron was born right after Simeon's wife died, and he was a widower there with Creasy. Incidentally, McMasters means son of the master in Gaelic. Now, while Simeon had no children by his wife, he had an enormous extended family because remember, he was 13 of 14 children. So he had scores of siblings, nieces, nephews, and cousins, many of which literally lived next door to him. Now, sometime in the early 1830s, Simeon promised Aaron and Creasy that he would try to free them after his death. Now, why did he make this promise? I don't know for sure, but there could be a variety of reasons. It could be that it was because Aaron was his biological son. It also could have been that Simeon didn't have confidence that his extended family would treat Aaron and Creasy in the same manner that he had treated them during his lifetime. It also could have been a bit of manipulation. Maybe Simeon made this promise as an incentive to Aaron and Creasy so that they would be loyal and obedient in service, hoping their reward would eventually be freedom. Or it even could have been that as Simeon McMasters came to the end of his life, maybe he was convicted in his spirit about keeping Aaron and Creasy enslaved, and he decided that he wanted to free them for religious or moral reasons. But whatever the reason or his intention, he made the decision to try to free them after his death. And I love to use the quotes try, because regardless of his intention, legally freeing those who were enslaved in North Carolina was difficult to nearly impossible. Why do you ask? Because that's exactly how the General Assembly of the state of North Carolina intended it. In the 1830s, when Simeon McMasters made this promise to Aaron and Creasy, requirements to legally free enslaved people were extremely stringent. First, the enslaver had to apply to the county court to petition to free the enslaved person. Then they had to put up 2 bonds of security worth $1,000 each per each enslaved person. And then the enslaved person had to leave the state of North Carolina after 90 days for good, because if they returned ever in their lifetime, they could be sold back into slavery. And then the former enslaver's bond would be forfeited. And if you're wondering, well, would anybody ever really know? There was an incentive to snitch, because if you snitched on a formerly enslaved person returning, you got to keep part of the forfeited bond of the enslaver, and the other part went to the warden of the poor. Now, I'll go ahead and tell you, in case you're trying to do the math, Simeon McMasters' estate was nowhere near what he would have needed to free either Aaron or Creasy. His estate at the time that he died was around 150 acres of farmland, a house, a blacksmith shop, and some other personal items that were barely worth $1,000. That's not even enough for one of the 2 bonds of security that would have been required for both Aaron and Creasy. Now, there were 2 exceptions to these requirements for emancipation. The first was known as Meritorious Service, which meant that if the enslaver wanted to free an enslaved person who was over the age of 50, they had to provide evidence that they had done something above and beyond their normal required duties. So it couldn't be just that they were obedient throughout their entire lives, but that it had to be something above and beyond. And that way, the person over 50 who was freed could stay in North Carolina. The other exception was by act of the General Assembly, where individual petitions could be made to the North Carolina General Assembly on a case-by-case basis. You can imagine how difficult that must have been. Now, when it comes to these petitions, here's a research tip for you. If you would like to see if anyone you're researching was involved in one of these petitions to free an enslaved person, and that can include the enslaved person, the enslaver, witnesses, sometimes even neighbors, check out the University of North Carolina at Greensboro's Race and Slavery Petitions Project. It's a really, really valuable resource that has a lot of valuable information. So, if Simeon really was intending to try to free Aaron and Creasy after his death, he would need some sort of way around North Carolina's emancipation laws. So what was this scheme that he created to try to free Aaron and Creasy? Let's first talk about the Quakers. Now, as many of you may know, the Quakers, formerly known as the Society of Friends, are a religious group founded in the 1600s by George Fox. The Friends fled persecution in England and took advantage of the religious freedom offered in states like North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Maryland. The group became known as the Quakers because of their critics who claimed that the Friends quaked or shook with religious excitement whenever they spoke. Quakers are known for their belief in nonviolence, pacifists in war, plainness in dress, speech, and living. And they also have quite a reputation for playing a significant role in the struggle to end slavery and improve the lives of the enslaved, such as their participation in the creation and operation of the Underground Railroad. Although this history, like most histories, is complicated. Now, one of the consequences of these Quaker-led efforts to end slavery or to do the next best thing, which they thought was improving the condition of those enslaved, was that Quakers actually ended up becoming some of the largest groups of enslavers in North Carolina. Yeah, you heard me right. The North Carolina Yearly Meeting, which is like the congregation of Quakers in North Carolina, in 1808 acted to relieve the burdens of their enslaver members by taking advantage of a 1796 statute that allowed societies to buy and sell property. Now, the North Carolina Quaker Yearly Meeting authorized its members to transfer title of those who were enslaved to the yearly meeting itself. By 1814, the group was the legal owner of nearly 800 enslaved people. The Society of Friends was one of the largest enslavers in the state. Now, those who were still legally enslaved, but who were owned by the North Carolina Yearly Meeting, were sometimes referred to as Quaker Free Negroes. These enslaved people held by the Quakers, the Quaker Free Negroes, were given more autonomy than their legal status would have afforded them as enslaved people. But the program, if you will, was a bit controversial. To afford the maintenance of the enslaved Quaker Free Negroes, the North Carolina Yearly Meeting had to use part of the earnings of the enslaved population to support those who were very old or very young. It begged the question, were they profiting from slavery or creating a system that wasn't that much different from slavery? Now, in the decades before the Civil War, the transfer of ownership of enslaved people to the North Carolina Friends Meeting was aggressively challenged in court, all the way up to the North Carolina Supreme Court in several instances. Research tip for you. If you really want a really great read about the complicated history of Quakers, African Americans, and the struggle for freedom and equality, I recommend Fit for Freedom, Not for Friendship: Quakers, African Americans, and the Myth of Racial Justice by Donna McDaniel and Vanessa July. Now, there's a group connected with the Quakers, an unofficial group that I learned about that had a really central role in my family's story. These are folks that weren't Quakers, but they lived among them, migrated with them, so much so that people might have assumed they were Quakers even though they weren't. These folks were called Friends of Friends. Now, Simeon McMasters and many of his siblings would definitely qualify as Friends of Friends. And if you're researching Quakers, a tip about that is the Quakers took meticulous records that have been preserved. So depending on the state that you're researching, you might be able to find out if the person you're researching or a family were Quakers. Now, you should check out the U.S. Encyclopedia of American Quaker Genealogy. It's most often referred to as Henshaw's Encyclopedia. The records show information on migration, since Quakers would seek permission to move from one meeting, the congregation, to another. They also have birth records, death, and marriage records as well. And you might even find if someone you're researching was disowned or banished for marrying a non-Quaker, or you might be researching somebody who was the cause of a Quaker being disowned. This happened several times in the McMasters family. There are many places where you can access Henshaw's Encyclopedia online, including Ancestry.com. Now, Quakers were among the earliest religious groups to protest slavery, but they were smaller in number compared with other religious groups in North Carolina in the early 1800s. So if they're going to really have an impact, how would they convince people of other faiths to oppose slavery with them? Now, one of the obstacles they had was that there was a lot of ignorance on the behalf of some about what the Society of Friends was all about. They were very insular as a religious group. You know, they had the adherence to plain living, resistance to a strict hierarchy in their congregations, and their pacifism and opposition to war made some people suspicious. So, anti-slavery Quakers decided that they would create anti-slavery societies outside of their congregations that would be more ecumenical. So those who weren't Quakers would be more encouraged to join, whereas they wouldn't have joined just a strictly Quaker congregation. Now, who would be the people most likely to join these societies? You guessed it, the Friends of Friends. One such group that formed in North Carolina had its first meeting on July 19, 1816 at Center Friends Meeting House in southern Guilford County near Greensboro, North Carolina. The group was called the North Carolina Manumission Society, and it followed in the mold of similar societies that have been created in Tennessee, for example. Now, the official name varied over the years of its existence. It was known at one time as the Manumission and Colonization Society of North Carolina. One of my favorites, because it was certainly a mouthful, was the Manumission Society of North Carolina for the promoting of gradual emancipation of slavery and for ameliorating the condition of the African race among us. That would be very hard to put on a bumper sticker or a business card. But we'll refer to them for the name that they had for the most of their existence, the North Carolina Manumission Society. Now, they are what you would call today a lobbying group. Now, what did they lobby for? First, let's review some of the terms that we use to describe freeing those who were enslaved to understand what the Manumission Society's mission was. First, most of the terms that I'm about to share are used interchangeably, but the slight differences and nuances make a big difference in our family's history. First, you have abolition, which is the act of officially or legally ending slavery by a government. You have emancipation, which is the act of being freed from bondage by a government or private authority, and it refers to the person being enslaved, not the institution. You have the term manumission. This occurs when an enslaver frees the person that they hold in bondage. It comes from the Latin manumittere, which means to release from one's power, to set at liberty, to emancipate, literally to send from one's hand. Now, what's key with manumission is it has to include the master or the enslaver's consent. There are also some other terms that we use when we talk about freeing enslaved people. There's immediatism, which that's the policy of advocating the immediate abolition of slavery. We also have gradualism, which is the policy of achieving the abolition of slavery through gradual steps rather than one drastic change. Two bonus words that we'll talk about as well today. One is colonization. That's relocating formerly enslaved people to places like Liberia, Haiti, or even free states in the American West. This happened involuntarily and voluntarily, sometimes as a condition of freedom. There's also what we call amelioration, which was the policy of improving the situation of enslaved people if abolition didn't look like it would be possible. So now, getting back to the North Carolina Manumission Society, the mission of the group was to promote the gradual abolition of slavery, ideally through the manumission or freedom with consent of enslavers. How did they go about doing this? Their goal was to use what they called persuasion, what we would call lobbying today, through moral, religious, even economic and practical arguments to convince white male public opinion, including enslavers, that slavery should be ended. Now, they were not secret about their meeting or what they tried to do. In fact, just the opposite. They wanted to be a very public group to win over public opinion. As you see from this newspaper article, where they advertised that they had their meeting with the headline, "Look at this." This is hardly a group that's trying to stay under the radar or be secretive. Just to give you an idea of the kind of language that the North Carolina Manumission Society used in its persuasion lobbying efforts, I want to read a little bit of the memorials that they sent to the North Carolina General Assembly. In the first, they talk about the vulnerability of enslaved women to sexual advances. In the memorial that they sent, they said, "The chastity of the female slave lies constantly exposed to the rudest insults of the other sex, both bond and free, not only of their own color, but, we blush to say it, of white men also." The North Carolina Manumission Society also tackled a really big moral issue as they saw it, that sometimes slave owners, maybe at the end of their lives, who wanted to, for whatever reason, to free those they held enslaved, couldn't because of those strict manumission laws that we discussed earlier. Here's what they said in one of the memorials to the North Carolina General Assembly. The owner of slaves has no means of divesting himself of that property, if property it may be called, however strongly his convictions may incline him to do so. Men, even in their dying moments, are not permitted to exercise that liberty of conscience which we have thoughts no human legislature could take away. So it's with those types of arguments that the North Carolina Manumission Society thought that they could change public opinion about the institution of slavery. You also heard me correctly when I said this anti-slavery lobbying group welcomed enslavers, which is one of the many reasons why they were controversial. The second reason they were controversial was their belief was in gradualism. And that did not sit well with those who believed that slavery was immoral or a sin. Because think about it, how could you justify taking a stand against a sin, but you allow it to taper off? That's not how sin works. So that was a controversy that they had from the very beginning. A third controversy that the North Carolina Manumission Society had was their belief in colonization. And there was a time, as I mentioned earlier, that colonization was actually a part of the group's name. Now, colonization was often used as a tool by pro-slavery advocates to rid the country of free Blacks or freed Blacks because they believed that they were negatively influencing those who remained enslaved in North Carolina. Also, the controversy over colonization had to deal with whether or not it was voluntary or involuntary. And even those who could be convinced to support colonization, they realized that as a practical matter, it was prohibitively expensive and it would not be successful in significant numbers. Now, controversy number 4 was that some of the most prominent members engaged in and advocated for finding ways around the laws that were prohibiting emancipation, the laws dealing with slavery, and taking advantage of these loopholes. Now, these tactics didn't sit well with all Quakers because they believed that their peace testimony required that they not break the law, even if that law was unjust. These controversies almost ended the North Carolina Manumission Society before it even got started. Some of the most prominent founders left after these controversies came to light, the most notable being Levi Coffin, who would later become what some call the president of the Underground Railroad. Now, I will say that the North Carolina Manumission Society was ahead of its time when it came to women's participation. While women were not allowed to be full members, they were recognized and praised for their work in what they called auxiliary branches. They made petitions to the state legislatures where they urged stricter punishments for sexual relations between Blacks and whites, and they also advocated for preventing enslaved mothers and their children from being separated during sales. So, if anyone was going to be able to help Simeon McMasters come up with a scheme to find a loophole for the North Carolina emancipation laws, who would it be? Yes, of course, the North Carolina Manumission Society. Now, at the time when Simeon McMasters needed this help, the president of the Manumission Society was a man named Benjamin Swain. Now, of all the people that I was introduced to in my research, he is one of the most fascinating. He was an attorney in Randolph County and a newspaper editor, and his nickname was the Man of Business. Now, he was not a Quaker, but like Simeon McMasters, he and his family were definitely friends of friends. Benjamin Swain's nickname came from his immensely popular series of articles and books called The Man of Business, or Every Man's Law Book, aimed at helping laymen carry out common tasks such as deeds, taxes, accounting, and of course, last wills and testaments. Benjamin Swain basically created an 1830s version of LegalZoom. So for the scheme that Benjamin Swain had in mind, he needed 4 people to play roles in what he was designing. And to recruit those 4 people, where would he go? he had to look no further than his fellow members of the North Carolina Manumission Society. Now, when he selected these 4 members, he chose 2 who were Quakers. One was Hezekiah Sanders Clark, and the other was Jesse Kemp. Remember, Jesse Kemp's letter is what we talked about from the very beginning. And then 2 of them were friends of friends, Henry Ellison and John Miller. So what was the scheme that this man of business had cooked up? A carefully crafted last will and testament for Simeon McMasters. Now, before I tell you about the will, I want to tell you how I became introduced to it. In my great Aunt Evie's bedroom, she used to keep it in a frame on her dresser. And I remember that whenever I would go to visit Aunt Evie, I would always sneak in her bedroom. And I remember looking at the will and seeing it in this frame and just being, first of all, amazed that something this old was still around, and that that handwriting in that faded paper talked about us, about me, our family. And how did I ever realize that this will had anything to do with the North Carolina Manumission Society? Well, when I started researching it and I started inspecting the will, there was a notation, B. Swain. And when I researched him, I found him to be the man of business. And from there, it was a short leap to finding out more about the North Carolina Manumission Society. Okay, here's how the will was supposed to work. 2 of the trustee friends, Jesse Kemp and Henry Ellison, were to inherit everything that Simeon McMasters had, his real estate as well as his personal estate that included Aaron and Creasy. With the help of the other 2 trustee friends, John Miller and Hezekiah Clark were supposed to pursue all legal means to secure the freedom of Aaron and Creasy legally. Now, if the trustee friends were not able to secure the legal freedom of Aaron and Creasy, they were supposed to allow them to live as free, enjoying and using Simeon McMasters' estate as if it was their own, even though they would still technically and legally be property of the trustee friends as enslaved people. And here's a research tip for you. First of all, for the trustee friends name, that came from the will itself. It was used around that time as kind of standard boilerplate. That was what people referred to as the people who were the executors and the administrators as their trustee friends to carry out their will. But in this instance, given the role of the Society of Friends and the Friends of Friends, the trustee friends took on a new meaning. So whenever you're looking at documents like wills and letters and everything like that, remember to look beyond the surface, because there's often meanings that you might not see at first glance. The other research tip was this situation called virtual freedom, as I mentioned, that Aaron and Creasy, if they weren't allowed to become legally free, that they would be virtually free. This was a term that was coined by the late and great Professor John Hope Franklin, who I had the privilege of having as one of my professors at Duke University. In virtual freedom situations, people who were legally and technically enslaved were given, for a variety of reasons, autonomy beyond what their legal status would have afforded them. This last will and testament was also controversial because it totally left out and disinherited Simeon's white extended family. Remember, I told you how big his family was, and there were a lot of nieces and nephews who just assumed that they would be getting whatever was left in Simeon McMasters' estate because he had no children, or as they called it, legitimate issue. Now, I honestly don't know if they knew about the will before Simeon died, but even if they did, would they have believed that he would have gone through with it? So, you know what they say, that day that you prepare for, it'll come. And sometime in late August 1840, Simeon McMasters died. Now, so many things that happened in those 6 years between when the will was signed in 1834 and when Simeon McMasters died. The first was that the North Carolina Manumission Society disbanded. Only a few months after the will was signed, the North Carolina Manumission Society had its last meeting. Now, I don't know if what they did for Simeon McMasters was their last official act, but it was definitely among their last because they did not meet anytime after 1834. Now, let me tell you a little bit about that last meeting. Although they didn't know that that was going to be their last meeting, there was definitely an elephant in the room. a very strong feeling that the North Carolina Manumission Society was failing at its mission after nearly 20 years in existence. From the minutes, we see that the first order of business was to take up the consideration of the state of the society and the question, shall the society longer continue its efforts? After much discussion, as noted in the minutes, the consensus of those gathered was that the institution has not yet achieved the whole object which Providence has designed for it. Before they adjourned there was a motion for the president, the man of business, Benjamin Swain, to, quote, use such means as his judgment may seem expedient to arouse the sleeping branches. But the North Carolina Manumission Society did not meet again. And one person I want to give a shout out to is a man named Joseph Hodgins, because a lot of people have asked me, how do I know so much about the intricate details of the North Carolina Manumission Society, the details of their meeting and their membership? Well, it's because of Joseph Hodgins. He was a member of the Manumission Society who was present at that final meeting, and he took the minute book with him. And 60 years later, when he died in 1891, the minute book of the North Carolina Manumission Society was found at his estate sale. And it was then transferred to Guilford College, where anyone can go online and look at it today. So we have Joseph Hodgins to thank for preserving this valuable history. Now, that wasn't everything that happened in those 6 intervening years. 2 of the trustee friends had left North Carolina. Between 1834 and 1840, Jesse Kemp and Hezekiah Sanders Clark moved to Indiana. From around 1800 until the outbreak of the Civil War, approximately 12,000 Quakers living in Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia migrated to Indiana and Ohio. More than half of those who migrated were from North Carolina. There's also another bit of controversy that happened during those 6 years. Simeon's extended family publicly alleged that Aaron, who was still enslaved, had fathered children, plural, with white women, also plural, and eventually made these allegations in court. Now, on behalf of my great-grandfather Aaron, I want to state publicly that such scandalous accusations were Simeon's family's way of ruining Aaron's reputation and putting his life in danger. And I also have to say that those allegations were 100% correct. So the big question that you probably have, that everybody has after they learn about the will scheme, was, did the scheme work as everybody planned? And the answer is no, not at all. I want to thank you for taking time to learn about my family's history today. And I hope that you have found tips and leads or other information that might help you in your journey. If you have tips or questions about my presentation today that you would like to share, send me an email. My address is me@calvindark.com. You can also follow me or send me direct messages on Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn @TalesDarkside. You can also check out my website at www.calvindark.com. Now let's take some questions.